Hello guys, and welcome to my build and review of this Sturmtiger. This is the 1/35th scale kit from Reichswald models. This is the first Reichswald kit I've built, and this is the partial interior version of the kit. There is a full interior version as well, but this version, as you can see here on the side of the box, only includes enough interior for you to look down into the fighting compartment. So it includes the gun breech, and it includes some shells, and the floor and the brackets to mount the shells as well, but no engine, no driver's seat, no transmission and so on. So even with a partial interior, the box is quite big. There are lots of sprues in here, many of them for the individual track links and the pins that go with them. The tracks are supposed to be workable. Other components will be very familiar to people who have built Tigers before, because of course this is built on the Tiger chassis. As you can see, the top of the fighting compartment is a single piece. This bag contains the spare shells for stowage inside the fighting compartment, and you can see here just how big those shells are. And the small decal sheet contains 3 German crosses and some markings for those shells. And there's a small photo etch sheet as well at the bottom. There is one large clear part here, which is the top of the fighting compartment, and that's designed so that you can leave it clear and see into that fighting compartment detail if you want to. As I move on to the build, one of the things which characterises this kit is lots of tiny parts. You can see here, for example, step 1 of the instructions, we've got these 3 parts being combined to make some kind of handle, and if we look at those parts in real life, you'll see there that centre part there, A101, is absolutely tiny. It's smaller in real life than it is on the instructions. So I decided to build out of sequence and start with the lower hull and the suspension arms. This is a really easy construction phase. As you can see, there's a good amount of detail there on the interior as well. Some of that will still be visible through the fighting compartment. Some of this construction did remind me a little bit of Dragon kits, where they're perhaps a little bit over-engineered. Some of these radio components here, for example, are 4 or 5 pieces, when it's hard to see why there couldn't just be 1 or 2. You can get an idea of that here from the instructions. And the Y part here is a photo etch part, so you get an idea of just how small those parts are. The sides and the rear of the fighting compartment went together well. There were no fit issues here, no need to fill anything. And although there are a couple of minor ejector pin marks, none of them will be seen in the final model. This piece here is the floor and the mechanism for loading a shell. One slight problem I did find here is that when the floor goes into place, there isn't anything to keep it at the correct angle. So as you can see here, it could be sloping upwards, it could be sloping down, or it could be level. There's nothing to suggest which is the correct angle there. And you can't put it parallel to the sides either, because the sides of the hull are deliberately at an angle. So there's a bit of guesswork involved in that. The bulk of the interior is made up of these brackets which hold the spare shells. There are 4 of them on each side, For some reason each bit is made up of one photo etch arm and one regular styrene arm. I'm not quite sure why that is. I did have a problem with these. If you look at the instructions, the arms are in alignment vertically, but when you add them to the piece, it doesn't seem to be possible to get them to lay that way using the indicated numbers. And in fact, even if the numbers are wrong and you use a different piece, it doesn't seem possible to line them up properly. This is kind of exacerbated by the instructions only showing one side and then just saying make two, which is not very helpful at all. Of course, if you think about it, if you look at the pieces here, say part C10 and C33, if you were to use those on this side here, the left-hand side, clearly that arm is towards the back of the piece. But if you were to flip that and put it on the right-hand side, then that arm would be further forward. So something is wrong, I think, with these instructions. Not to mention the fact that if you set it up as it's shown in the instructions here with these arms, the rear arms are too far back and they catch on the rear of the fighting compartment. So this was a little bit of a mess up, to be honest. The gun barrel is very short and it requires you to add these small blocks to it. There are no guiding pins for those, so you do need to be careful to make sure they go in the right place. The barrel construction is fairly standard, and the instructions make it clear that there should be no glue used on certain joints, and that means that the gun can still be elevated and rotated. The end of the barrel has three different options. You can see here slightly different patterns on those holes. The instructions don't detail the differences between them. I simply chose the one which looked nicest to me. And then there's some very interesting photo etch here. This strange looking sheet is actually for the rifling inside the barrel, and the idea is that you bend it like so and insert it inside the barrel. That was quite a difficult thing to do. And of course the photo etch does fold naturally along those lines, but that doesn't leave a smooth circular surface. It leaves a surface which is quite flat in places, so it does take a while to get that in nicely. And I did in fact have to trim a little bit of the photo etch off the end because it stuck out a bit too much. As you can see, there are lots of details on the inside of the fighting compartment. I haven't shown all of the pieces being added because they're quite small and fiddly, but suffice to say it's a good level of detail. And again you can see the breech there, looking very detailed indeed. You can leave that door open, but I decided to keep it closed. The engine deck is well detailed. It's interesting to compare this with the Tiger engine deck which I built recently, and you can see the difference in the number of parts. Of course, one of the reasons this is separate is because this kit also has the full interior version of the engine, and so the pieces are separate to allow for that. I did have a little bit of a problem getting these engine covers to stay in place, and even on the final model they're not perfectly flush. There is some detail on the roof of the fighting compartment on the interior. I'm not too worried about the blue marks here because I'm painting the clear part anyway, but if you were leaving it clear, obviously you need to consider that and your choice of glue. The instructions allow for the hatch to be open or closed, although it's not necessarily super clear that you can do that. The instructions simply offer you two different parts depending on how you want it, but they only show one diagram. To attach the tools, Reichswald supply photo etch brackets. The instructions don't mention it, but on the sprues there are also versions of the tools with the styrene brackets moulded in. I used the photo etch brackets where I could, and where it was going to be too fiddly for my patience, I used the styrene versions. Talking of patience, there are workable tracks. There is a jig supplied to put 5 pieces together and insert 4 track pins. These pins do need gluing in place, however, or they fall out, so although they are workable, it is not an entirely glueless solution. And of course you have to be careful with that glue not to put too much on and stop the tracks from working. The guide horns are hollow and individual, and despite having to add 2 guide horns to each track piece, this wasn't as long and tedious as I thought it might be. Here you can see how the spare shells will sit inside the fighting compartment, and also you can see the sheer size of the shells that this thing fires. The crane on the back is a simple affair. The cable is represented using some copper wire, which is a little bit hard to bend into shape. I think it's better than string, but maybe a different solution could have been nicer. And here is the completed model before priming. You can see there's quite a lot of photo etch on there, and I haven't used it all even. These parts are still just dry fitted to make painting easier. And as a final touch, I noticed this piece here left over on the sprue. It's not mentioned in the instructions, but it does appear on the box art. And I quite like the look of that. I think those little spiky points make it look quite aggressive and change its appearance as a vehicle quite a lot, so I decided to add that on. When it came to painting the interior, obviously the majority of the vehicle is empty and I didn't really want to highlight that fact, so I painted it overall in NATO black, and then I picked out in the correct colours the areas which would be seen, so basically the floor of the fighting compartment there in the red oxide primer colour. And as you can see there with a sample fit of the fighting compartment, you can see the red floor, you can't see much backwards and forwards, so the black is doing its job quite well. I then painted the sponsons in that ivory off-white colour which German tanks used. And the same thing for the interior of the casemate. I went quite lightly with this so that some of the black was still showing through as a simple form of dirt or pre-shading. And again, once we put the roof of the fighting compartment there, there's very little you can see. I did consider building a styrene firewall between the engine bay and the fighting compartment to block out any excess light, but when I dry fitted the engine grille I found out that not much light came through anyway, so it wouldn't be a major issue. I did some chipping of the interior using a dark metallic colour. Because the interior would be quite well hidden, I went pretty heavy on this. I figured those arms which hold the shells in particular would be quite heavily chipped. Given the multiple rows of wheels on the Tiger, I attached the first row and painted them before I could add the second row. I've never had much success with gluing the wheels together and then removing them as one component, so I went for this approach instead. Of course, one of the standout features of this vehicle is this camouflage pattern with the very distinctive sort of dog bone shapes in the dark yellow colour. There are a few ways to simulate these. You can paint the camouflage as normal and then just hand brush the bone shapes on there. But then you still have to deal with the edges between the yellow, the brown and the green, which has got a very distinctive curve pattern to it. So the way I decided to approach this was to use some Tamiya masking sheets and a hole punch. I punched out a series of holes like so, and then the inverse of that would form the mask for the painting. I did consider keeping the holes and individually applying those, like you can see here, and leaving small gaps between them. But I decided that would be excessively fiddly and I would end up damaging something as I removed them. I gave the whole vehicle a base coat of Tamiya's dark yellow 2, and then applied the masking tape for the first colour, which would be the green. And you can see that pattern there. I haven't strictly followed the pattern on the box art or the instructions, but I have tried to stick to the same ratio of dark green to base colour. And once the green is applied, and this is Tamiya's dark green too, you can remove the masking tape and you get your camouflage pattern. And then of course you simply repeat the process with some more masking tape for the red-brown colour. And when applying the tape here, I deliberately made sure that the brown overlapped with some of the green and the yellow. Because if you look at the artwork, the green and the red-brown are always butting up next to each other. So rather than trying to make the brown precisely match the existing edge of the green, I just went over the top and it gives you a new edge, if you see what I mean. And again, once that red-brown is applied, and we remove the tape, there we go, we have our 3-colour camo. So that gives us the 3-colour scheme without the dog bone patterns. I did consider hand painting those, but then I figured I would try to stencil them on instead. To do that I use a piece of card and I cut out a small pattern. You have to be careful to make sure the edges are really sharp, and also to make sure that it is quite small. It's actually surprisingly hard to cut such a small pattern out. For some reason I lost the footage I had of me spraying these, but you can see here the result of them being sprayed, and I think they look fairly good. In a few cases I was slightly far away with the stencil, so the edge is not perfectly sharp, but I don't think it detracts from the appearance too much. One thing to note is that the decal sheet for this kit includes 3 crosses for external markings, but the so-called painting and marking guide in the instructions doesn't include any guides on placement. Looking at a few external photos of these vehicles, it seems that not all of them included markings, but I quite like the idea of some markings, so I went to the spare decals envelope and pulled out a few that I liked. Next up was a bit of light chipping. I applied this with a fine brush, and I used a base yellow colour lightened with a small amount of buff. I applied the chipping in the obvious places, around the edges, high wear areas, the hatch here where the shells would be loaded. I chipped the brown and the green using the same yellow colour, assuming that if those colours chipped they would reveal the base coat yellow. And in particular I went quite heavy this time on the engine deck. At this point I also painted the details like the tools, using a combination of Tamiya and Vallejo paints. In terms of the weathering, I really like these Abteilung 502 modelling oil paints which I acquired recently. They've got such a great texture, the pigment is really fine. They're perfect for all kinds of weathering. And I started by thinning down this shadow brown colour and using it as a pin wash to bring out the details. And of course I applied that all around the casemate, to the weld seams, any bolts and similar items, and on the wheels too, of course. I added some oil blending effects with a darker colour oil paint to simulate a combination of shadows and dirt, and these were unthinned oil paint and they were blended in with a dry brush. I went particularly heavy with these on the roof of the fighting compartment, as these were presumably more highly trafficked areas. After painting the tracks in a slightly darkened NATO black, I used some silver paint to highlight the areas of polished, worn metal. These stand out quite a lot at the moment, but they'll be toned down later by the weathering. And on the reverse side of the tracks, I dry brushed some silver over the raised detail there to also represent worn metal. I used the AK Dry Mud Splashes product to add some dirt to the wheels and the tracks. Again, I'm not quite sure where the footage of this went, but I applied the product on directly with a brush. And once it was starting to dry, I blended the edges with a damp brush. And I put some mud up on the engine deck as well. As that product was drying, I added a couple of laser cut paper leaves, and they will stick to the product once it's dry. And then finally, after looking at this picture of a recovered vehicle from the Imperial War Museum archive, I decided I would add a bit of graffiti, presumably written by the British crews who captured the vehicle. And that's going to fit in nicely with a future video where this vehicle is going to be posed in a small diorama. And you can see in this last shot here that I've added some streaking effects going up and down the hull. Again, I'm not quite sure what happened. I don't seem to have recorded that, or I seem to have lost the footage. I think I need to be more careful about my footage and perhaps not have quite so many projects going on at once. But you've seen me doing streaking effects before, so you can look at some other videos and see how that was done. Okay, and with that the model was complete. As always, before I show you the final pictures, let me take a moment to say thank you very much to everyone who watches, and in particular to my Patreon supporters. Whether you watch, like or subscribe, comment, or subscribe to the Patreon scheme, it really does help, and I do appreciate all of your support. Thank you guys. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed watching that build. It was a little bit longer than some of my videos, but I wanted to make sure that I covered the interior quite well. I did enjoy this kit. It is the first one I've made from Reichswald models. I am now looking quite forward to building their Panther tank with the full interior. That might be a project for the new year actually. As I mentioned earlier, I do tend to have quite a few projects on the go at once, which is a bit of a problem. I think on my desk at the moment there are about 6. So I'm going to try to finish those off so I can start the new year with a clean desk. I will add a poll later this week to the community page on my YouTube channel, so keep an eye out for that, and if you have any ideas about which kits I should build, also feel free to leave a comment below. So guys, until next time, I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you very much for watching.